All right, then. Let's jump right in. Today, we're going deep on Rahul Gandhi.
Oh, yeah. He's definitely someone who people have a lot of opinions on.
That they do. I mean, he's fascinating.
Yeah.
This whole dynasty thing, the reluctant heir narrative.
And the fact that everyone seems to have a strong opinion about him, even if they don't follow Indian politics that closely.
Exactly. So we're going beyond the headlines today. You sent over a really interesting collection of articles and interviews. I think we're going to uncover a side of him most people don't get to see.
Yeah. One thing that really struck me when I was going through all this was just how many contradictions he seems to embody.
Now, it's like, he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't,
Totally. If he leans into the whole Gandhi legacy thing, he's accused of being entitled. But if he tries to distance himself from it, then it's like he's rejecting his own history.
Right. And then you factor in his childhood.
Yeah.
There was anything BT ordinary.
I mean, his family history is basically a crash course in modern India. The highs, the lows. You can't talk about Rahul Gandhi without talking about the impact of his grandmother and father's assassinations.
Yeah, having family members assassinated, that's got to shape your worldview, right?
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder about his decision to enter politics. Was it destiny? A sense of duty?
It's such a paradox because he's often painted as this reluctant politician, and yet he undertakes something as massive as the Bharat Jodo Yatra.
Yeah, that's not exactly dipping your toes in the water. Walking across India like that, thousands of kilometers.
4,000 kilometers. I get tired just thinking about it. So what was the strategy there?
Well, it was a brilliant move, honestly, on a couple of levels.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So tactically, it let him directly engage with everyday people. It helped him shed that image some had of him being, a member of this out-of-touch elite. But then strategically, it was about taking control of the narrative. The BJP had spent years pushing this whole Papu thing.
Painting him as this lightweight, a bit of a joke.
Exactly. And the Yatra was a chance for him to redefine himself on his own terms.
And it seems to have worked. I mean, at least to a certain extent. A lot of pieces you sent mentioned this shift in how he was perceived, even among his critics. There's this one anecdote, I think it was from an event at UC Berkeley. He gave this surprisingly candid interview, and people, even some who weren't exactly fans, came away with a newfound respect for him.
I read that one too.
What do you think changed for those people?
I think they saw a different side of him. He was vulnerable, intellectually honest, willing to say, hey, I don't have all the answers. You don't see that side of him very often, but it was definitely on display during the Yatra.
So it wasn't just some PR stunt. It sounds like the Yatra was as much about Rahul Gandhi getting to know India as it was about India getting to know the real Rahul Gandhi.
Yeah, kind of like he was stripping away a layer or a persona. And what's really interesting is that this newfound relatability didn't make him soften his stance on the current political system.
Especially his thoughts on what he calls system capture by the BJP, right?
Right. He's still incredibly critical of that.
So we're back, and before the break, we were talking about this more authentic side of Rahul Gandhi that kind of came out during the Bharat Jodo Yatra.
Yeah, definitely seemed like people were seeing him in a new light.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about the image, right? We were getting into some of his core beliefs about India, his vision for the country, and it's clear he's not afraid to challenge the status quo.
No, not at all.
So let's dig into that a bit. What kind of change is he actually pushing for?
Well, one of the most consistent themes you see, if you look at his speeches, his writing, is this really sharp critique of the current economic model in India.
He doesn't hold back, does he?
Not really, no. He sees the system as fundamentally unequal. It benefits a very small percentage of the population, while a huge chunk gets left behind.
Okay, so it's about more than just GDP growth for him.
Way more. He's concerned about unemployment, the lack of opportunity, particularly for young people, and he's really focused on the struggles of rural communities.
Which makes sense. I mean, India is still a largely rural country.
Exactly. So the question becomes, how do you balance this emphasis on social justice and economic equality with, India's need to compete on a global scale?
Yeah.
Especially with China right there.
Yeah, China is kind of the elephant in the room, isn't it? So how does he reconcile those two things?
That's where his whole system capture argument comes in.
Right.
He argues that this focus on crony capitalism, the close relationships between the government and certain big businesses, it's actually holding India back. And he makes this really fascinating comparison with China. He says that while China was laser focused on building this massive manufacturing base, India, and actually a lot of the West too, We got caught up in the whole services thing, the branding, basically putting our logos on stuff made elsewhere.
Ouch. That's got to sting a little.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow, but I think he has a point. It's like we outsourced our way out of having a real manufacturing sector.
And now it feels like we're playing catch up in a world where the rules are changing again with AI and automation and all that.
Exactly.
So what's his solution? Does he want to build a wall around India and say, nobody's trading with us?
He's actually more nuanced than that. I mean, he recognizes that global trade is a necessity, but he believes that India needs to prioritize building up its own manufacturing capacity, particularly in sectors where it has a natural advantage.
Okay, so less about protectionism, more about strategic investment.
Yeah, he talks about investing in skills development, fostering innovation, creating an environment where small and medium-sized businesses can actually thrive.
So it's about a more self-reliant India, but also a more inclusive one?
Exactly.
But how do you convince people who are benefiting from the current system, even if it's a flawed system, how do you convince them that change is necessary?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And to be honest, the sources we looked at, they don't really offer any easy answers.
Right.
He talks about the need to really expose the cracks in the system, to empower communities that have been marginalized, to amplify voices that have been silenced. And he keeps coming back to the importance of democratic institutions.
A free press, an independent judiciary, all that.
All of that, which he argues has been eroding.
Yeah. And it feels like that's a trend globally, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So it's like he's fighting a battle on multiple fronts here. Economic, social, political. Can he actually win?
It's hard to say. I mean, he definitely faces an uphill battle, but what's clear from everything we've read is that he's not giving up. He sees this as a fight for, for the soul of India in a way, and he's committed for the long haul.
Oh, yeah, certainly given us a lot to think about. When we come back, we'll explore the challenges facing Rahul Gandhi and the Congress Party as they try to, bring about some of these changes. We'll also get into his thoughts on foreign policy and India's place in the world. Stick around. All right, so we've talked about Rahul Gandhi's past, his vision for India, but can he actually make it happen? Because the sources you pulled, they don't exactly paint an easy road for him, do they?
It's one thing to have ideas. It's a whole other thing to get an entire nation on board with those ideas, And with India, it's not just about the sheer size of the country, it's the complexity. The social divisions, the economic disparities, and let's be real, the deeply entrenched interests that benefit from the way things are.
Right. And we've talked about system capture, this idea that the BJP has a pretty firm grip on power. So how do you even begin to dismantle something like that? I mean, is that even possible?
Well, it seems like he's trying to tackle this on multiple fronts.
Okay, like what?
So first, he's really trying to rebuild the Congress Party, from the ground up, focusing on grassroots organizing, building coalitions, bringing other opposition parties together. And that's where the India bloc comes in.
Right, the India bloc. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, isn't it? To have all these different parties, some of whom used to be rivals, putting aside their differences to present a united front against the BJP.
It's definitely significant. Shows there's a real desire for change. But obviously, alliances alone aren't enough to win elections.
So what about his actual policy proposals? What's he putting on the table?
Well, he's talked about strengthening social safety nets, investing heavily in education and healthcare, promoting sustainable development, all things that, could make a real difference in people's lives. But he's also walking this tightrope, right?
In what sense?
I mean, he's trying to appeal to a very broad base while still offering concrete solutions. And he's doing this in a system that, as we've discussed, is kind of rigged against him.
It's a tough needle to thread, for sure. And on top of all that, he's also advocating for a more assertive foreign policy, right? One that really puts India on the world stage.
Yeah, he definitely wants India to have a more prominent role in global affairs. But at the same time, he still sees value in non-alignment, in maintaining a certain level of independence, which again kind of goes back to that theme of balance.
It's interesting because you see this real emphasis on inclusivity with him, on dialogue, on finding common ground. But how do you square that with some of the very real threats India is facing, like China's aggression on the border or the rise of religious intolerance within India itself?
He's been critical of how the current government has handled those issues. He's called for a more strategic and in some ways a more measured approach.
So what would that look like?
Well, for example, with China, he's in favor of keeping those lines of communication open, but he also believes India needs to strengthen its defenses, be prepared.
Makes sense.
And when it comes to religious intolerance, he's been incredibly vocal about protecting India's secular identity. For him, it seems like that's fundamental to who India is as a nation.
Tolerance, respect, those are things he talks about a lot.
Absolutely.
It's funny, right? Because for years, he's been painted with this reluctant politician brush, and yet here he is, grappling with some of the most complex and sensitive issues facing India, and not shying away from those tough conversations. But I guess the big question is, can he actually lead? Can he inspire people? Because to bring about real change, you need more than just good ideas.
You need people to believe in those ideas and in your own. And that's what remains to be seen. I think the sources we've looked at, they show us glimpses of his potential. He's clearly intelligent. He's empathetic. He can connect with people from all walks of life. But at the same time, there's also this vulnerability there, this sense that maybe he's still figuring things out as he goes along.
And he's constantly under a microscope. Every move, scrutinized, analyzed, criticized. Plus, he's got the weight of history on his shoulders. That's a lot to carry.
It is. And I think ultimately, whether he succeeds or fails, it's not just going to come down to his own abilities. It's going to depend on the Indian people, on whether they're ready to embrace a different vision for their country, a different kind of politics. So yeah, a lot to unpack there.
There is. Listen, you've given us a lot to think about today. We've gone way beyond the usual sound bites and stereotypes. We've gotten a much clearer picture of Rahul Gandhi, the man, the politician, the leader he's trying to become. And while we may not have all the answers, I think we have a much better understanding of the challenges he faces and the stakes involved, not just for him, but for India. So that's it for our deep dive this week. But the conversation doesn't end here. Keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, and most importantly, come to your own conclusions. We'll see you next time.